Chapter 221 Humble. Chris. Point of view. The ensuing battle with both dungeons was rather fun and cathartic. The upgrade waves didn't carry the same feeling that the dungeons did. Level 95 bosses, whose bodies were a step above the rest that their level didn't indicate, with Tier 2 laws, were a tough nut to crack. It wasn't as effortless as mowing through the previous 8th floor bosses had been. My new stats alone made those nearly a breeze. The monster itself was always different along with the elemental law they used, but it was always only Tier 1. On the off times it was something I had an advantage over. It was near effortless to dispatch them. One poor Yeti-looking creature even tried to use an ice law against me one time. I laughed in its face. Of the laws I'd battled against, venom was my least favorite, with poison being a close second. Sorry, Mitchell. The reason was because the effect lingered. It wasn't over when the thing was dead. It continued to churn away long after the offending monster was crushed to oblivion. Other laws were harder to face head-on, but none were as annoying as those because it would stay lingering even as I faced off against the next beast. Plus, all my ice did was slow it and make it less effective. It didn't have a way to get rid of it. Lightning wasn't fun either, as it could go through my ice armor and shock my body with relative ease. But nothing in the dungeon had a Tier 2 law back then, which made the shock easy enough to push through. Light was another I was beginning to find annoying. It made me change my idea of perfection for my ice. Skills followed the will of their user, which meant my intent played a role in how they manifested. My idea for the perfect ice used to be the perfect crystalline structure, clear as glass and as hard as steel. Getting light beams shot straight through it with little more than token resistance made me change that ideal. Foggy and clouded ice worked better, but light found a way through that too. Blood was another annoying one, but that came in a few different shades. One monster used its blood law to heal itself, sucking the blood leaking out of it back in and sealing the wound. Some tried to control mine as it leaked from wounds, but freezing it was enough to stop that from happening. Watching blood re-enter a wound had been nasty to watch happen. While there were laws that countered mine, there were just as many I dominated. Nature and water specifically, as I could freeze both and turn them against the wielder. Nothing could touch my authority over ice yet, but wind was still a struggle. It was almost fun to battle against the dungeon monsters in that respect. It did a lot for my control over the element. The fact my body was near imperviousness to the weak winds gave me a little more leeway with those fights. Fire was another that was fun. It was immensely pleasing to see the monster's face when their beloved fire petered out and wouldn't ignite. Those fights usually ended with the beast frozen solid to make a point. One that stood out from the rest, not because I countered it or was weak against it, but because we were evenly matched, was stone. I could freeze stone with permafrost, but that didn't give me enough leverage to compete for its control and only made the stone stronger. My wind could wear down on it, but not in any significant amount of time. Those fights usually turned into a slugfest as their stone constructs battled against my ice ones. Theoretically, stone was stronger than ice, but I sure as shit didn't believe that, and I liked proving it at every opportunity. Metal was fun for the same reason, but I had an advantage over it that made it easier than stone. When fighting against metal laws for an extended period of time, the cold made them brittle and the fights didn't last much longer after it shattered. They weren't helpless, as they chipped away at my ice and could cut through it if I wasn't careful, but given enough time, I would win. While the fights were all well and fun, it was the rewards that truly ramped up. The first few floors gave out pittances compared to the 9th floor. The first gave out barely a single copper and the second was hardly better. It wasn't until passing the E rank threshold on the 6th floor that the rewards matched expectations. The 9th was nearing the peak of E rank and the rewards given matched. It gave nearly a silver just in coins, not even including the worth of the material. The metal that one of the dungeons gave was filled with mana, which Vincent and I bought up all of it we could to work with. High-quality materials were one of the only reasons I leveled my profession so quickly. I didn't spend as much time on it as I should have. It paid to be rich, or get a portion of the material through taxes. On average, from the texts Abigail had, it took anywhere from half a year to 3 years to make it through E rank. 50 levels in both in 6 months sounded impossible, but those people probably didn't have to actively rebuild civilization at the same time. I wondered how far ahead I'd be if fighting was all I did and only focused on advancing. It was an idle thought because it wasn't something I cared much for. It would take as long as it took. Rushing wasn't the point. Building a firm base would take me much further. D rank would cause things to slow down. To get through all 100 levels of both class and profession would take anywhere from 5 to over 20 years. C rank was even worse. D rank was also where most people would start to fall off. Souls could only go so far. Everyone had a different soft cap they would eventually hit. The weight/strength/robustness, however you wish to phrase it, of their soul could only hold so much essence. Forcing more essence in wouldn't result in more levels. The only way to go further would be to keep pushing and experience new things. Rote repetition wouldn't lead to godhood after all. Some would last longer than others, though. I imagined everyone in harder tutorials and who had faced death more than others would make it higher than those who hadn't. Once the limit was reached, it would turn into not only accumulating essence to level but strengthening the soul to be able to hold it. The speed everyone was rising through the levels now was lightning fast compared to the rest of the universe. Living through the end of the world had a way of doing that. Nothing gives experience like everything you know and have grown accustomed to getting turned on its head and everything under the sun wanting to kill you. That had a way of forcing people forward. Those born after the change would have it harder, as they didn't have the lovely experience of nearly dying countless times. It made me wonder when my limit would come. Would I make it through D rank? C rank? I did nearly die a lot, and for some reason I don't think the demons will be the last time. I was on my way back from the dungeons when my train of thought was interrupted. A runner that Abigail had hired flagged me down. "Sir, word from down south that the fighting is over and there are sealed letters for you to open," they said quickly and succinctly and barely caught themselves before bowing. I trained them well. Quick, to the point, with no fanfare. That had nearly been an exercise in futility, but I managed to get through to everyone eventually. There would be no bowing in my city. Good. Tell Abigail I'll be right there after I clean up. The man nodded and ran off back toward the city. As much as I wanted to rush off with him to read what happened, I didn't think everyone would appreciate the smell of the blood and gore covering me. One bad thing about the dungeon monsters being real was their guts didn't disappear off you when you left. Washing up was routine by this point and took little more than a few moments. Leaving my armor for later helped cut down on the time it took. With the excuse of having to make another set, I held nothing back on its design. I wasn't quite at the point of being able to carve 4 runes on it yet, but the 3 I did were all my best work. Nearing peak grade in rune engraving. Runes I used a lot, like durability, frost, and protection, gained enough practice to reach high grade in carving them long ago. The push to keep getting better was a slow one, as most of the easy flaws and subtle flow issues had already been worked out, but I was slowly moving toward being perfect. It was hard to go further as I didn't have the skills necessary to even see the flaws, let alone fix them. Formation's mana flows was the only reason I had come so far in such a short time. Along with the runes being my best work, I used the best metal we had available coming out of the dungeon. There was an endless by order out on any isoline metals, but those were a rarity and I didn't have enough to make a full set from it. But I did have enough to make just the breastplate. Before the demons, we didn't have enough people who could clear the entire dungeon, which meant getting metals from the 8th floor was rare. Now, though, a lot more were coming out after full clears, which made all the smiths happy. Instead, I had to use neutral metals or ones easily influenced to ice and infuse them with the affinity I wanted. It worked well enough, even if it wasn't as good as being isoline to begin with. Beggars couldn't be choosers. The craftsmanship was much better than my last set and would hopefully last me a while. At least until enough isoline metal was built up so I could make a full set. After taking off the armor, I picked out from my wardrobe what had grown on me immensely now that the weather called for it. Furs. Whenever I'd seen them depicted in shows or films, they always looked too thick and heavy to be practical, but that wasn't the case. After walking around in full plate, furs felt like they weighed nothing and the freedom of movement was astounding. Plus, they were soft. I wasn't like the others. I didn't have to wear anything for the cold, but I liked to, and the attire had quickly become my favorite. Sam and Ashley, while healers most of the time, had done a fantastic job on my clothes. They'd managed to save bits of the wolf leader I fought so long ago, and it was its fur that lined the top of my cloak. Bits from other animals had to be used on my tunic and the rest of my clothes, but there was enough of the ferocious beast for the cloak. The furs settled in nicely, and I was off to find out what happened. Austin had been keeping us well apprised even before we sent more down there to him. His descriptions were usually filled with curses at the bugs, but they were clear enough to get a good picture. It made me want to go down there, but I stopped myself from the urge. I didn't have the time. Finally, we were waiting for half an hour, Abigail shouted when I finally entered the room. It was more crowded than expected. Nearly everyone was there. Had it taken that long? I'm here, I said. Where are the letters? A stack of neatly folded parchments was thrust into my hand as Abigail tapped her foot impatiently. To add security to our messages, Gabriel and I had come up with an enchanted seal. It was quick work, as I had been in the middle of carving the wards, but it was simple enough that I doubted people would be able to break it without time to research it. The downside was I had to open them, as no one else could do it without the letter going up in flames. There were other inefficiencies to work out, as we had to send them with the enchanted paper so they could write their letter on it, but we would work out something better in time when things slowed down. The seal didn't really do anything other than combust if someone who wasn't me opened it. This one's for Sam, I said after opening the first one. It's from Alice. This one is for Connor. I looked closer to make sure I had it right. It's from Mitchell. I tried to picture why Mitchell would write to Connor but couldn't before I had to move on. I opened and handed out all the ones that went to other people and was left with 2 that were addressed to me while Abigail had 4. I eyed her stack, then looked at mine, then at hers again. Aren't I supposed to be the leader? Of the 2 I had, one was from Austin and the other was from the other city lord. Chris, you would not believe the bullshit I just pulled. It was like I was impersonating you out there. I won't go into the details as I want it to be a surprise, but I will tell you that our next spar won't go as you imagine. I may finally win. The fight was difficult, but we pulled through in the end. Marcus led well and made everything all the easier. Maybe you could take notes? I wanted to take back the treasure I found for you guys, but that won't be possible. It's tied to this area and can't be moved, or else I would have tried. Apparently, Abigail has already discussed terms for its use. Not sure when she did that though. This is usually the point where I'd wax on about my exploits, but I thought I'd wait to do that in person. My armor is pretty much scraps at this point, and while the leatherworkers here are decent, I want the best. Maybe I can ask a special someone to enchant it for me again? To their credit, the leatherworkers here don't have a lot of material to work with. The bugs eat anything that comes close and don't exactly leave the hides out for them to grab. None of their dungeons reward it either. It's bad form to think that's funny, but I can't help it. This place hasn't exactly been the fun adventure I pictured. Maybe tell Jonathan to bring leather when he comes to trade? See ya in a few months, asshole. Yours truly. Not what I expected. I can't tell if he's gotten more or less humble. Chapter 222 Internal Storm. Dear City Lord of Frostheim, it is my honor to write to the one who aided us when no others would, and I would like to send my sincere thanks. Without your help, I'm unsure if we would have been able to do what we did. As I understand it, we owe you a debt. I owe you a debt. If you ever have need of me or my city in the future, you need only ask and we will be there. Your mayor has already reached out in regards to the treasure we unearthed. As much as I would like for it to remain secret, I can't put the cat back in the bag. If you give us a few months, we will be ready and waiting to receive those who you chose to send to experience it. If you wish to do so before then, I must ask for your understanding of our lacking accommodations. As much as I'd like to go on with my thanks, I have other news I feel you should know. I'm not sure how much your friend or cousin was able to glean from his stay or if he was looking for it at all. His abilities were far above where we predicted they were initially, which would have allowed him to reach things we intended to hide. Even if he managed to sleuth out all of it, I feel it's important to make sure you hear it from me. We've been approached by multiple pylons who petitioned us to join their factions. They all saw the position we were in and sought to leverage it against me. All offered partnership but required me to swear fealty. While the offers are important, It isn't the part that I wish to inform you of. With their messengers and diplomats coming and going, word has spread of the happenings to the south, and not all of it good. War has already broken out and more are soon to follow with skirmishes already occurring. The city of storms, or Old Chicago, was recently conquered after a bloody battle and people are fleeing from the fighting. Other cities have similar stories with outside forces trying to expand their holdings. In the heart of it all, a faction has been gobbling up all pylons near it by methods we aren't sure about. They expand too rapidly for it to be done through conquest and there isn't word of any battles taking place. They've grown quickly and now have most of the East Coast under their command. I'm told you used to be American before it all went to shit, so I'm sure you understand when I tell you where their capital is rumored to be. Norfolk, Virginia. Rumors say Washington was lost and survivors are trickling out of where it used to stand, but it's too far away for any information to be accurate. I, myself, don't know what to do with this information, but I feel I should inform you of it. Attached are the locations of every pylon we've heard word of and their suspected locations. It's the least I could do and I hope this serves you well. My thanks, Marcus Shieldwell. The other letter was informative. That was a bit of an understatement. Austin had been keeping us appraised of what he learned, and he informed us of a few pylons, but that was nothing compared to what was in the letter. Austin wasn't there as a spy, as Marcus seemed to have assumed, and he didn't spend a lot of time trying to sneak around and uncover information. All he did was send along the things he heard or saw. Our war map had only 7 pylons on it before and Marcus's letter had markings for over double that. All were spread out over distances we couldn't hope to reach. Our scouts ventured far, but what was depicted was thousands of miles away. It would take months to get there in even the best conditions. Some were nearly a year's travel away. While the warning of the growing faction was welcome, it wasn't really something we had to worry about right now. Even if they stopped focusing on what was around them, it would take over a year to get any sort of fighting force to us as far away as we were. Seeing how much more informed the other city was pointed out one of the rare downsides to settling where we did. While we were isolated in the north without any threats nearby. We were isolated in the north and any information had a long way to travel to get to us. Still, I would take being up here rather than being down there. Most of the letter was something we couldn't do anything about, at least not right now, but there was one thing I had to ask about. Abigail, what did you negotiate for? I asked. The letter said my mayor already had a deal in place and now I was curious as to what she cooked up. She brought it up at one meeting a while ago, but I hadn't been paying much attention. I usually let her do her thing as my input wasn't always needed. I had been busy with something else and my mind forgot it. Well, Austin told us that there was a valuable water affinity treasure down there, and I made sure we would be able to use it. We weren't sure what it was, but I covered all the bases. If it was a one-time use, we would pay for it through trade. If it was a sustainable source of water mana, the same would happen but would allow the other city access to it if it was movable. And if it wasn't movable, they would allow access for us to go down and use it. From what we know, it'll be perfect for purifying water bloodlines and studying water laws. She said, "Oh, that's perfect. I know you're close, so you should go down there dash." I was cut off. "It's already planned. We'll go in 2 groups so we don't all leave at the same time." She said, "That's good. If every water affinity left, half our family would be gone. It wouldn't be that big of an issue, as we could easily handle the monthly waves, but it was better to be safe. I wouldn't be here after all." Austin was on his way back, which put me at ease, and according to his letter, was much more powerful now. This winter was slated to have everyone working on themselves. Then, after spending time catching up in areas we were behind on, we would go for the Baron upgrade. Maybe even higher depending on how much more powerful everyone grew. We needed bloodline parts sooner rather than later. Nick, point of view. Lightning struck with a resounding boom and another wave of its mana raged through his body. He was barely finished dealing with the last one when another bolt started the searing pain back up again. He was nearly immune to lightning and had used that resistance when fighting the other city lord. All the lightning he had been able to throw at Nick was shunted into the ground or used as power, with Nick being fine. But this was different. Even if he was just using his body as a conduit and shunting the lightning into the ground, he would be left singed and smoking in pain. What fell from the sky was that powerful. It had taken months just to be able to build up a tolerance and reach the edge of the pool of buzzing water at the center, let alone let the mana rushing into his body. The technique book had the steps laid out for him to follow, but he hadn't anticipated it being this hard. In months since the battle, he was only on the 4th step. Step 1. Attune yourself to the lightning, saturating your entire body, channels, and mana pool in pure lightning mana. Step 2. After that is achieved, move on and add wind to the growing lightning. It should mix and swirl as a thundercloud instead of rage and fight. Coexistence is key. Step 3. Then, when both lightning and wind are in harmony, add water. Water gives the clouds weight. It gives the lightning power and wind substance. It binds all three together into what will eventually become storm. Whatever attuning meant nearly killed him. Nick opened himself up to the lightning and nearly died when a bolt struck him. He learned quickly that being near the center was much too powerful for his body to handle. What followed was weeks spent starting at the edge of the blackened sand, inching closer day by day. Eventually, while he wasn't able to sit in the pool at the center, he reached a point where the errant strikes wouldn't burn his flesh and send him to the nearest healer. After that, he added wind while trying to keep the lightning from going haywire. He wanted them to mix, not to fight for dominance as the book said, but it was easier said than done. Wind was easy enough to gather, but hard to capture. It howled through the ruined skyscrapers endlessly, taking the previous city's moniker to heart, but refused to be still, as he wanted it to stay in his body. Nick spent weeks mixing the two and then even longer adding water into the mix. The work was endless, painful, and occasionally resulted in all the hair on his body being burnt off from losing control, but he did it. The 4th step was simple to read, but he was finding it endlessly frustrating to implement. It had seemed so easy at first as it was barely a line in the technique book. Step 4. Once lightning, wind, and water are all equally attuned, combine them and forge the internal storm. It was what his technique book was named after and its claim to fame. The raging internal storm mana cultivation. Mana cultivation was nothing like Nick expected it to be. While he hadn't gone through any of the barbaric body refining techniques himself, he'd seen others who did and read his fair portion of the books before. They reforged the flesh through terrible pain, granting the person unique abilities. Reforged in fire would grant fire resistance, poison would grant poison resistance. When leaving the tutorial, he saw the ones available to him and what they would do for his body but dismissed them. He was a mage. He didn't need to have a strong body and didn't want to waste his limited reward points on it. Instead, he had turned to the other side of the body path. Mana cultivation. They were told that it existed and little other than that. Frustratingly little. Nick assumed that if body refining was meant for warriors, mana cultivation was meant for mages, which was why he forwent buying a body refining technique. And he was right. Partially, but that part didn't apply to him. Body refining strengthened the body. Mana cultivation strengthened the mana pool. Both aspects of the body path of power, but separated. Instead of painfully ripping apart his flesh for it to grow back stronger, Nick was in the process of forging his mana pool into a mana core. It would give his mana pool shape and structure. It would grow larger and increase the amount of mana he could hold. What used to be only possible through wisdom was possible through mana cultivation, and it wasn't only that. It would improve all his magical stats. Similar to how the body got stronger and more robust, improving upon the physical stats, the same happened to the magical. Turning his pool into a core would make his pool bigger, more concentrated, and his mana would regenerate faster. It was perfect for him. Nick could only snicker at the fools going down the other route. They were afraid of the unknown and went with what was more understood. Biology was easy. It was studied even before the change and led to body refining being widely popular, even among mages who didn't need it wasting their time when it could be better spent making them stronger. This would cement his power. With this and his law, he would be able to stand over everyone, and his coming evolution would only make him stronger. All he was waiting for was the mana to do it. Every lightning bolt, gust of wind, or drop of water pushed his oversaturated mana pool that much further and gave him the fuel he needed. Even if it took days filled with pain, he would forge a flawless core even if it killed him. Why settle for lower grades of core when he could go for the best? Chapter 223, Northern Territories. Chris, point of view. We can delay and see you off tomorrow. Are you sure you want to leave in this? Abigail gestured out into the growing snowstorm. The snow had started falling as the sun rose and a good few inches were already on the ground. The clouds were abundant, forewarning much more to come. The first snows of the year had come and gone when my arm was finishing up and the current storm dumping a layer of snow on everything was not the first. Watching more accumulate, the layers building, it was making me antsy. I knew that winter would last for multiple months, but I couldn't help but want to start now. It technically wasn't even winter yet, as the solstice had yet to happen. It was still a month away, which made this a fall snowstorm. Bah! There's no better weather. This is perfect, I said boisterously, cheerful that my journey would begin with a fun start. It amused me they wanted to delay on account of the weather when they knew I had conjured worse. Others were already limiting their time outside and everyone already switched out of any metal armor they wore. Any warriors that fought in plate would only put it on after they were in the dungeon, as counterintuitive as that sounded. Putting it on after clearing the first floor was less dangerous than freezing to death on the way there while the metal sapped your heat. The only way around it was lining the inside with furs and trying to do the same on the outside, which didn't always work that well. It made for a bulky layer to fight in. You read the report, right? Abigail asked after I denied delaying. The scouts ranged far and wide around the city, and she had compiled together all the information we had on anything to the north of us. It would only last for a few days to a week until I traveled past where our scouts had been, but it was better than nothing. Yes, I read it, but I may need to check and make sure our scouts weren't drunk, I said. The papers said there were saber-toothed tigers or something remarkably similar that was spotted last week before the snows came. They weren't drunk. We don't even have any alcohol, and that isn't the first report we have of fantastical creatures. She defended her information. Why did you have to go and bring that up? What I wouldn't give for a cold beer. My eyes misted just thinking about it. But yes, I remember. What was it last time? I tried to remember the last report stating they saw a beast that was impossible. Woolly mammoth woolly rhinoceroses. That one came in the previous winter from a scout who deviated from his course and lost his way in the snow. With everything covered in white, it was easy to get lost if one wasn't careful. He ended up spending a week in the snow and came back with wild stories. While so many things had changed, for some reason, people drew the line on extinct beasts walking the earth again. Most for the simple reason they hadn't been the ones to see it. Some had traveled far and wide without a hint of anything fantastical. Some came with us from Ohio and covered thousands of miles without a hint of anything like it. It's not that far-fetched, and I wish you would take it more seriously, Abigail chided. You can create a localized blizzard and the world grew by at least 2 sizes. What difference does it make if there are woolly mammoths again? I know. I waved her off. It's just amusing to think about. You should tell Austin about it when he gets back. He'd go out in a storm even worse than this to see that. Thinking about how much the man complained about the snow the last time he was here, it made me chuckle to picture him bundled up wading through it trying to find something fantastical. As much as I liked to annoy my sister, I did actually think the reports were real. It wasn't that far-fetched to believe in them when everything else had happened. Honestly, it was more unbelievable to not believe in them after all that happened. People could shoot magic out of their fingertips, yet some still held onto the past reality like they would crumble away if they didn't. It was a part of the trip I had been looking forward to the most. Painstakingly building up the city took time and effort I couldn't spend elsewhere. The only traveling I did, other than to go fight demons, was to the dungeons and back every day. I wasn't the one out scouting or free to explore the surroundings for anything cool. I was stuck here and could only read reports of the cool things. But now was my chance to lay eyes on the mythical myself. The child inside of me couldn't wait. Alrighty then, I said, slapping my legs. It's now or never. After saying the customary Midwest goodbye, it took another hour until I was finally out the door. Everyone had come to see me off, which was entirely unnecessary. Anna and Josh waved their little goodbyes, while the rest looked on from atop the wall. Remy had been particularly upset that I wasn't bringing him. I never did get to ride him as much as he wanted. Sarah would be his caretaker while I was gone, though as I wasn't sure he would survive my trip and I didn't have the room to pack food for him. It wasn't like he would be able to graze where I was going. Speaking of food, my pack was loaded with jerky of all kinds. It would last me a long while, but I would still get most of my food through hunting. Fires would be difficult to start, but I had ways around that. With everything set, my hammer strapped in, my pack loaded down, and my feet ready to get a move on, I left my city for only the second time, and this one was for a much more pleasant reason. Find an area of intense cold and breath of pure winter. My voice mocked as my feet plodded through the thick snow. What did it even mean? The snow had started to slow me down, as its depth had grown dramatically. I had spent the first week standing atop it, using my control to strengthen it enough to hold my weight. It worked to save energy but was utterly draining to keep up for an entire day. I had, at first, taken it as a chance to train. Now that I wasn't manipulating my arm every day, I had to find other ways to advance my skills. Ice manipulation was on the cusp of rare. I could feel it. After days spent doing the same thing for hours on end, it had gotten old. Even the dropping temperatures and picturesque scenery weren't enough to keep me going through the grueling task. I still did it occasionally, but it just wasn't worth it when I had the strength to power through the snow. Even when the banks reached above my hips, it wasn't hard to push through them with my strength. The first week had been a blast. I was free from all my obligations. I wasn't required to do anything. Everything was up to my own whims. Glacial presence grew with every passing day and with every mile north I traveled. While the boost was invigorating, and I was having a great time in such a pure Arctic atmosphere, it didn't feel like home anymore. It was comforting and familiar, but I had made my home elsewhere, built it brick by brick. Surprisingly, I was interrupted rarely. Now that I wasn't inside a populated area, I could let myself relax. The tight control I kept so I wasn't constantly pressing down on people was released. It felt like taking dress clothes off after being forced into them for a special occasion. The shoes especially, as I swore designers took a perverse joy in making dress shoes as uncomfortable as possible. In doing so, almost everything I encountered made way as I came through. Only a few things had stayed and growled, but I left them mostly alone. I wasn't there to kill everything in sight. Plus, they were only defending their homes and I could hardly begrudge them that. Some even had little ones with them, shuffled behind hind legs or curiously poking out of dens in the snow. The only ones to receive the hammer were the ones who didn't know to leave well enough alone. Either because of hubris or stupidity, it didn't matter, and they were perfect supplements for my travel rations. Gamey and stringy, but edible enough to not be disgusting. I had known that the Arctic would be more lively now and had even experienced it when the meat still rolled into storehouses last winter. But it was another thing entirely to walk among it. Felt wondrous. Rodents more fluff than flesh hopped in and out of tunnels burrowed in the snow, munching on the surprisingly lively plant life. None were the verdant green one would expect, but brown-gray and covered in a layer of snow and frost. The fruit of their labor was packed with snow and ice manna, as it was the nutrients the plants used to grow, and was a welcome break from the endless meat of my previous diet. Even raw and plain as they were, the bushes were scarce, but the little fluff balls found their way to them through the feet of snow. Stalking them were predators both on land and sky. Arctic foxes and feline hunters diving through the snow after prey was like a scene out of a nature documentary. It was the foxes who usually went after the various rodents, as the cats liked the snow hares more, at least from what I could tell. While those were cool to watch, it was another that fascinated me more. Snow owls. They were silent, nearly invisible, and incredibly deadly when they hunted. I could watch their wings flap and not hear a thing. They were that silent. Even with snow covering the land and making sound carry as it did, I still couldn't hear anything. Even though my perception wasn't my best stat, it was still way better than a normal human. Other than being completely silent, their coloring made it nearly impossible to see them. Pristine white feathers were easily lost in the sky with other specks of white drifting down. Even spots of gray and brown to break up the solid color didn't give it away and did the opposite, making it even harder to spot. Lastly, I had yet to see one of them miss a dive. Even the best predator in the world wasn't 100% successful. I didn't think the owls were perfect, just I hadn't seen one miss yet. It was fascinating to watch and made me want one. Sarah could keep it well-fed and happy. I shook my head. Maybe in the future, but now wasn't the time for it. She was busy with the horses and the wolves and was expecting foals in the coming summer. Plus, it seemed wrong to take the owls away from their natural habitat. Their white coloring made them invisible here, but it would stick out like a sore thumb without the snow to blend it. Instead, I only observed while I walked. I wasn't sure where the perfect spot would be, but it wasn't hard to imagine that it would be further north. It was impossible not to feel the change as I walked. Thicker, purer ice manna suffused the air, and there were even hints of Arctic around. There was even a sudden snowstorm that carried ice laws I walked through a few days ago. That had been a surprise, and I took a detour to experience it before the storm broke apart. It was my first time seeing laws naturally, and it did not disappoint. We knew they were a thing from others, as we heard stories of a tornado destroying most of a city with wind laws spread from some of our new arrivals. I wonder if I'm in the Northern Territories yet. Feels like I've been walking for months. Is that even the right province I'm in? Fuck it. It's not like it matters anymore. Chapter 224 Interlude. Good boy. Sarah. Point of view. A riot of noise surrounded her as she made her way through the kennel. High-pitched yips of excitement from growing puppies were followed by low rumbling growls of warning from Lulu. The horses had been rough, but they were nothing compared to the complete workload of keeping track of and an eye on the dozen scoundrels. Lulu's litter had been larger than expected. She expected the puppies to stop at 4 or 5, but she continued pushing more out until an even dozen were all nuzzled against her. It was a welcome change. Well, welcome in the fact there were more of the cute fluffballs. Not welcome in the fact there were now over double the things to keep out of trouble than expected. The job was never-ending as they seemed to thrive on getting into places they weren't supposed to be. It was enough to wear her out even with her higher endurance, and she was near her wits' end. She considered asking Jonathan to take her through one of the dungeons for a few levels just so she would have more energy to spare watching, but decided against it. She was already growing fast enough already. She didn't need to go through the dungeon too. She'd already been warned repeatedly not to rush and focus on things other than level. Level isn't everything. Jonathan would lecture. The tone and cadence of it was something she could impersonate in her sleep. He said it often enough. Sarah knew he was right. She'd seen Chris fight and knew that he didn't get his strength from his levels. But it was boring to sit and meditate about laws. Even the one for her affinity remained out of reach. The only easy one to do was body refining, but they wouldn't let her do that yet. They claimed that she was still too young and her body was still growing. They aren't my parents. I can do anything I want. Even though she thought that, she didn't make any moves to change her course. Sarah knew they were right, but just didn't want to admit it. She was stuck advancing slowly, not that what she was doing was considered slow. She rose in level faster than nearly everyone else just by taking care of the little ones and doing what she wanted to do anyway. Even if they were an absolute handful right now. Lulu did what she could, but Sarah hadn't had any time to train her, let alone the pups before she was due. Lulu understood most things already, like not attacking people and no biting, but she didn't know enough to caution the pups into not doing things. Why would she care that furniture got chewed up by the little ankle biters if she herself didn't know it was bad? Luckily, Sarah's skills made bathroom training easy enough, and the wolves were smart enough to catch on quickly. The innate knowledge to not dirty their home made that process much smoother. The only solace to the whole ordeal. She had cleaned up after them enough the action had invaded her dreams. One of the bigger pups from the litter came bounding over excitedly when it noticed she was there, but she had to disappoint the little one. "I don't have any treats this time. I'm sorry," she said while stroking the soft fur. They were growing nicely. It was nearly enough that she couldn't keep calling them pups anymore. At nearly 3 months old, they were shooting up in weight and size. If they weren't careful, they would knock her down if multiple started jumping on her. Inspect Tame came back with nothing out of the ordinary and everything was still going fine. She was lucky she caught the fleas and the worms early, or that would have been bad. She had begged Abigail for help once she found out, as she couldn't do anything about it short of picking through their fur by hand for the fleas. Luckily, Connor stayed behind when everyone left, and he was able to whip something up. It smelled horrible and stained her hands green for a week, but it killed off all the fleas. The pellet he gave her worked to flush out the worms as well. Her body instinctively shivered at the thought. She still remembered the aftermath of the pellet's effects, and it was pure nightmare fuel. It worked to purge the body of the worms, but it didn't have to do it in such a grotesque way. Other than that, though, the pups were growing big and strong. They transitioned to solid food well and were weaned without any issues. The food was a problem, but Abigail helped. Sarah wouldn't be able to afford all the meat the beasts were devouring by herself, but Abigail was able to work with the butchers and get the undesirable bits for her to use. Or when the odd wave came with humanoid enemies, they would keep them in a stockpile for her. Separated, obviously, but with the cold as it was now, they would keep for months, and the wolves didn't care about a little freezer burn. Her inquiry into the kennel today was to check on one of the troublemakers. Specifically, one that was doing its best to drive her up a wall. It was the best escape artist of the litter and constantly managed to get out of the kennel she had built. People were finding the wayward pup all over the city as it ran around sniffing everything new and would call for her all hour of the day. Apparently, the playtime and walks weren't enough for its adventurous urges. "Where are you, you little bugger?" A flash of white dashed to hide when it saw her coming, but that was enough to doom it. She caught it trying to escape once again and jumped to pick it up before it could get away. It was heavy, nearly too much to pick up on her own, but they were still a few months of growing away from that. "No! How many times do I have to tell you to stop doing that?" She scolded the thing. In its many escape attempts, the damage it caused was enough to force someone to come fix. Holes dug under the walls needed to be filled in and extra protection added so it didn't happen again. Holes chewed into the wall or door needed to be replaced. Somehow even a gap in the ceiling was used one time. It was like it could sniff out weaknesses in the structure to get through. Sarah found that the best way to keep the ball of energy contained was to give it some special attention. The others in the litter were content to play around and roughhouse with each other with the walks enough to keep them happy. This one needed a more personal touch. What started as her trying everything under the sun to wear the dog out turned into a game of sorts. One that was quite fun when she thought about it. Picking up her prize for the coming hours, she marched off with it in her hands so it couldn't run away. "You need a name," she thought while looking at the furball trying to get free from her grip. She'd held off on naming any of the puppies for fear that any didn't make it. Sure, Connor helped with medicine and they had healers if anything went wrong, but they had no vets. None of the healers specialized in animal care, and most were busy fixing everyone up. Jonathan had warned her not to get too attached in case one didn't make it, but nothing like that happened and they were out of the rough part. Cooper? No, it's not normal for this troublemaker. Trouble? No, that's just asking it to continue its escapades. His coloring and fur reminded her of sled dogs, and the name Togo popped up, but she dismissed that one as well. Dakota. Dakota sounds good. She had spent so long thinking about a name that she reached the woods outside the city by the time she decided on one. "Look who it finally is," Gavin shouted as Sarah came near. "We were beginning to wonder where you were." All the others started chatting as well, but Sarah stopped them. "Since he's out of the danger period, I thought it was time to name him." That sparked interest as the crowd of scouts all started shouting names they thought were cool. "Fenrir, Aurora, Balto. Wait, you're saying we can't keep calling him Dog?" Gavin joked. "Yes, Gavin, we can't keep calling him Dog," Sarah sighed. "And before you all start shouting suggestions again, I've already given him one. His name will be Dakota." They congratulated her and lavished affection on the preening dog in her hands at the announcement. Afterward, Hal walked up and silenced the group. All right, quiet down. Now that it's been decided, everyone knows the drill. You all have 5 minutes starting." All the scouts stopped chatting and got into ready stances. "Now!" All except for one of them took off at breakneck speeds into the woods, weaving in and out of the trees as they made to get away. The designated seeker was Gavin today as he stayed behind. Sarah watched while keeping hold of Dakota to keep him from chasing after them. She felt him tense to do just that and held on tighter. "Do you think you'll win today, Gavin?" Sarah couldn't help but ask. Gavin sighed. "I don't know. I'm getting better, but he's something else." The game had started out harmless at first but quickly turned competitive. Sarah had just wanted to tire Dakota out so he would stop trying to escape, and it ended up turning into so much more. The scouts had noticed their outings to play in the woods, and some came around to join her or chat, and things grew from there. Now it was an entire training activity they liked to call man versus dog. While they liked to call it a training activity for their own dignity, it was really just a game. They took hide and seek and made it a competition. A dozen or so scouts would race off into the woods and try not to be found while one seeker and Dakota looked for them. It let them practice their stealth while also training their tracking abilities. The seeker rotated so everyone got to work on both. The competition came about when Dakota was introduced. Sarah had thought it would be fun for him to try finding the hiders and set him to do just that. He ended up finding more than the seeker had, which sparked competitive spirits. It was downhill from there. Dakota had yet to lose. The 5 minutes ticked away and Sarah set Dakota on the snowy ground but still held on. As she counted down the seconds, she felt him ready to begin running. When she reached 0, she gave a command, "Seek!" Dakota raced off into the woods with Gavin hot on his heels. Sarah had thought the tracks left in the snow would have been a dead giveaway, but skills made that a non-issue. Some could even cover their tracks without skills. She knew how hard that was from her father's training. What she remembered of it, at least. After her 2 companions ran off, Sarah was left standing in the clearing alone. She remembered the one time Christopher had joined them for a game and how that ended up causing a smile to form. Chris was anything but stealthy. The fact he had just received so many levels didn't help. He had even less control over his aura than he usually did, causing him to be that much easier to find. He was the first one found, and it wasn't even close. Chris moped and then offered sparring to be the next activity. The scouts paled, but Abigail swooped in to save them. Chris was on a strict no-fighting order as he was still recovering at the time, and Abigail came in the nick of time. As she was thinking back, barks sounded out, followed by a curse somewhere else in the woods. Gavin was down 1 already. Sarah grinned. "Good boy." Chapter 225, Bitter Cold. Chris. Point of view. Brrrr. My teeth clattered together slowly as I marched through the raging storm. It was an odd sensation to have again. After going without it for so long, I almost forgot what it felt like. I was cold. Not just cold, but shivering in my boots, freezing. I hadn't felt anything close to a chill for over 2 years, and now I was doing everything I could to pull my fur cloak tighter and get away from the wind. I was thankful I liked wearing the heavy thing because it was marvelous against the cold. Although its condition wasn't the best, and it had seen better days, it was my favorite article of clothing right now, and nothing else came close. In somewhat of a twisted sense of humor, the best thing to fight against the bitterly cold winds was actually frost armor. It surrounded my body, even my burly cloak, and shielded it from the worst of the bite. Somehow, even with the skill creating a thick layer of ice around me, and then another thick layer of fur for the wind to get through, the chill still got through. I knew traveling through high mana density areas would change things, but this was something else. Even the wind held such power to go through everything I had to block it. It made me fearful of the other spots we noticed on the map. Ice and wind was my specialty. I had a specific resistance to the two, especially when they were combined like they were. But what if it was something else? The environment I was in now was deadly to everyone besides me. If that was the case, what did other places high in mana but not of ice and cold look like? What did that say about the world? Frostheim was located next to 2 dungeons, which made the magic there denser than in other places, but it was nothing compared to the thick bog of it I was wading through currently. We knew these areas would be deadly, but I had gotten complacent. The areas practically glowing on the map were easy enough to interpret as dangerous. I thought that being able to run through the dungeons unharmed, not much would be able to threaten me, and I had been proven wrong twice in quick succession. The demons came and nearly killed me, and now I was receiving a reality check just from the environment. An environment I was supposed to thrive in. Oh, I was way more powerful here than I'd ever felt before. but even I had limits and I was quickly reaching them. Soon, even frost armor wouldn't give the respite it once had, and I'd have to find another way to keep going. The power helped, though. If I didn't grow stronger as it got colder, I would have had to stop miles ago and change tactics. The weight of so much ice mana and at such purity caused even me to balk. It wasn't something I could take lightly. My body and stats were enough to get me this far, but the stats from Glacial Presence helped me push on further into the cold, and so did the steady beating of my heart. The latter wasn't something I could quantify, though. Glacial Presence was straightforward in its effects, but my heart was not. As the days got shorter and we neared the solstice, the swing in temperature grew wider. Cloudless days that allowed the sun's rays to bask the area in light were usually followed by cloudless nights that let all the accumulated heat escape, made the highs and lows brutal. It went from not that bad and only my cloak was enough to ward the cold away, to shivering while frost armor, my cloak, and bursts of Jotun's resistance tried their best to keep me from freezing to death. The effects it had on Glacial Presence were wild to get used to at first. Even with multiple hours between the highs and lows, it was still a massive swing in a rather short period of time. If it happened any quicker, it could be used as an attack. It was so disorienting. Another quirk of the skill that I found out while traveling was that it had a cap. A raging snowstorm with wind so fast I had to fight just to remain standing on 2 feet, and an ice law that neared my own in tier brought the coldest I'd ever felt, and the skill maxed out. I could feel it trying and failing to go any further with the boost. At a 33% increase in physical stats, Glacial Presence could go no further. The skill wasn't linear in the boost it gave. The colder it got, the less efficient it got, but still, to get an increase of a third was monstrous from only a rare skill. Other than the temperature becoming nearly too much, other things came into play. The atmosphere was chock full of mana, and the beasts used that to grow to insane heights. Some were already in D rank. I persevered through it all, trying to push as far as possible to get the perfect area to go through with it. The book said an insane amount of mana was needed to do it perfectly, and I was going to keep traveling until I physically couldn't anymore. Jotun's resistance flared briefly to give a small respite from the cold, and I marched on. I had been using it more often as my resistance wasn't able to keep up. Soon, it would be the only thing that kept me from freezing to death. Maybe I should have gone for Body of Stone first? It was too late to change it now. Plus, the process would take longer than the first time, which was something I didn't want to do right now. I wasn't even sure how long it would take to build something that I could even use. My foot came down, crunching on snow like it had countless times before. But something was different this time. It was a subtle feeling, but unmistakable. Ha! It only took over a month of walking and running non-stop. But here I am. I wasn't on the ground anymore. I was walking on ice. I'd reached the Arctic Ocean. Mana cultivation is one of the oldest methods of advancement in the universe, second only to body refining. The many techniques regarding it have been around so long that they date back to before the three paths were founded. Some even claim to have found evidence in ancient tombs or timeless inheritances that its methods existed even before the system, if what they say is to be believed. While interesting in its own right, I'm not here to debate the fabled histories and whether or not those statements hold kernels of truth. The point of this introduction is merely to inform of the possibilities this path holds. Mana cultivation is the other side of the coin to body refining, and both techniques combine together to make up the path of power through the body. I feel that should be a distinction that is made more often. Many a time I've heard young apprentices calling it the body path of power when they should say the path of power through the body. Unlike the semantics of describing the method, the process itself is quite simple. Almost deceptively so. It uses the principles already seen in nature as a guide, and all the various techniques out there are evidence of that. It would take much too long to go into detail about every single one, so instead, I will describe the process in the general sense. Mana, the mystical, arcane, or any other word the various races refer to it as. Mana is what the entire process revolves around and should be obvious from what the enlightened races have decided to call this method. The fuel for all manner of spells and enchantments, and the substance that can grant unlimited change. Cultivation, the tireless and unceasing perpetuation of the process. Continued advancement and growth through various stages. Most use the 9-stage limiter, but it is far from the only one. In the simplest words that even the Crothless could understand, mana cultivation is the practice of growing and advancing the mana pool through various techniques to improve the magical abilities of the body. Every being has a mana pool, no matter how big or small, and it is fact that it can be grown with essence, but that growth is only the bare minimum of what's possible. The first step onto the long road of what can be accomplished. Mana cultivation is the directed alteration and manipulation that builds upon what is already there, turning the base mana pool everything has into something so much more. Some techniques take inspiration from how beasts form cores and have the practitioner forge one of their own. Others use nature as the base, taking inspiration from the natural creation of mana crystals, and use that to form crystals in themselves in substitute of cores. Gorinth, the living stone, pioneered his method using stone as the base. The Order of the Phoenix Flame does the same with their eternal flame. The famous nymphs of the endless waves create internal oceans they continually grow and fill out. Either way, all the techniques referenced above create a localized storage that will continue to be cultivated and grown with mana until godhood. The method of storage differs, but all are similar in that respect. I feel it is important to note that most mana cultivation techniques follow this rule, but not all of them. I mention this purely to point out the endless possibilities there are for mana cultivation techniques. What the warrior races of Lothlorien, both orc and human, have done is outside the scope of this text and frankly, should be impossible. Some scholars still claim it to be so even with the evidence against that stance staring them in the face. The stubborn fools. While some claim it a perversion, the outcome proves its viability. Even if it leaves them practically crippled magically. They are known as one of the fiercest warrior kingdoms for a reason. How they did what they did is still a well-kept secret, and the Lothlorians would sooner die than reveal it, but what is known about the process can be studied in later volumes and isn't a topic this one will focus on. This is meant to introduce the method along with its many variations and what those variations provide in terms of benefit. Where one is better than another or worse than another, including any drawbacks should there be any. Excerpt from Introduction to Mana Cultivation Techniques by Master Arcanist Woodridge of the Baraxi Mage Tower. Abigail. Point of view. Abigail shut the book she was reading as her free time was up. It was something she had already read, but it didn't help to get a refresher. She had forced Chris to read it before he went off on his trip, and it had been a while since she had last done so. She had already gone through and cataloged all of the texts they managed to bring with them, and she put the book back on the shelf where it belonged. It wasn't like anyone would say anything if she placed it back somewhere else, but she would know, and it would bug her throughout the day. Their library was pitifully bare, as knowledge was one of the most expensive things they spent reward points on. They were lucky to have what they did. She doubted the fort had as much knowledge as they did. It was a point of pride to her, even if the handcrafted shelves by Mitchell were more empty than occupied. The room was planned for future expansion, and she hoped to see it filled one day. Some texts were new, even, and the bindings on those were made of pristine and fresh leather and lacked the timeless quality the other books carried. Those were written by people in the city. She had to hound Vincent to record his techniques and the process of smithing, but he got around to it, eventually even going so far as to describe his personal forging style. The same for Rachel and her insights into mana. Abigail hounded everyone for what they could give. Mitchell for poisons and woodworking, Sam and Ashley for leatherworking, Allison for traps, Braden for construction, Connor for alchemy, and Gabriel for skills. She even got John and Chris to detail what they could about forming an anchor. She wanted a repository for knowledge of everything they had accomplished so far. Abigail's heart winced at the driving factor behind why she had hounded everyone so. The hiccup after Scott died left them behind, and unskilled in carpentry Mitchell did his best to fill. Scott had done what he could to teach, but he was always busy doing something they asked of him. He was able to use his past experience and uncovered new and advanced ways to push his skills that Mitchell just didn't have the knowledge for. That could have been fixed through Scott's teachings, but he didn't have the time. It also could have been fixed if he had written down what he knew. If the worst were to happen, Abigail didn't want their knowledge dying with them, especially when they needed it most. The process of being able to know everything about anything being taken away had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She wasn't one to surf the internet for hours on end about useless things, but having that option taken away made her scramble to form a new outlet. She didn't like not knowing. Even if she didn't read everything out there, the fact there was more comforting than she knew. She hadn't realized its worth until it was too late and that option was gone. She didn't care for runes and enchantments like Chris and Gabriel. She wasn't fascinated by the various alloys out there like Vincent, or the alchemy processes like Connor. What she wanted was to know how and why something worked in the barest terms. The subtle intricacies behind things weren't important to her as much as the base function. She didn't need to be able to recreate something or make it herself, just the baseline for how it was made and worked. The general knowledge of how a car functioned, not the detailed training of a mechanic or the ability to machine one herself. The principles of why things worked. Abigail wouldn't say she had a thirst for knowledge, but others would definitely claim she did. She didn't see it that way. Knowing things was the baseline she believed everyone should be at, and it was everyone else's lack of knowledge that baffled her. Their lack of wanting to know confused her. She pulled the door shut behind her as she left the library and reinstated the magical lock Gabriel thought up. They weren't sure how strong it was, but it was the best they had. Similar to what Chris had planned during his journey, she was preparing to do the same. They had received the water method for mana cultivation long ago, but hadn't had the chance to do anything with it. Water mana was plentiful in the summer around the various lakes and ponds, but it wasn't dense or pure enough to do what the technique described. But that changed after Austin found the treasure. It was the perfect place to go through with it. So, similar to how Chris was going north to find the spot for his technique, she and others were going south to do the same. She was among the first half to go, and they were preparing to set out in the morning. It had been a month since Chris left, so hopefully the twins was prepared enough to receive them. The trip would give them even more time as it wasn't as quick as hopping in a car. The deadline for her to choose was coming up, and she still hadn't decided on where she would place it. The book she was reading earlier described the many options and variations she had available to her, but instead of helping make her choice easier, the options made it harder. She almost wanted there to be only one obvious option, like Chris, but she was granted the gift of choice, even if it caused her endless stress in choosing the right one. When it said the possibilities were endless, it truly meant endless. Did she want to be a better mage and forge her core with that in mind, or did she want to be a better healer and focus on that? Chapter 226, Frostborn Bloodlines. Abigail. Point of view. It still feels weird with all of us leaving, Abigail said while tying the straps of her saddlebag shut. She wasn't the best rider, but she could at least do it. If they went without and traveled on foot, the journey would take even longer. This will be the first time either Chris or myself won't be here, John said from the horse beside her. It feels odd. We get to explore. We get to explore. Two tiny voices cheered from behind them. It was a tough call, but she finally caved in. Everything she knew said not to bring them, but she couldn't bring herself to say no. Anna's face was criminal when she begged them to come. Josh was already tearing up before they even had the chance to say anything. Abigail knew that caging them up would only make the urge grow greater. If they stifled them here, Anna especially, would find other ways to get around it. Both John and her were fending off her attempts to learn how to fight already. If they said no again, she couldn't bring herself to do it. It was only a slight change of plans, but not all that different. John was supposed to stay behind and watch them, but now he was coming along to do the same. He had wanted to go originally, but they couldn't have both of them away for so long. Not only did she not want to dish her kids off on someone else for that long, but she wasn't comfortable with both of them being away for so long. Having John along helped ease her worry. She could hold her own and had been training day and night to do just that, and they would have others with them in case they were attacked on the road. But he was the main reason her worries about being attacked subsided. She also agreed because the twins was vetted and decided safe. Austin's ravings that the man in charge was honorable also went a long way when she made her decision. Plus, they needed to see the world. Being cooped up and hidden away wasn't good for them. Anna only had a few more years until she gained a class, and it already felt like it was too soon. John noticed her rising worry, falsely thinking it was because of something else. Everything will be fine. Rachel will do fine. She stepped up and did a good job after Chris was incapacitated, from what I heard. While he was right and she was worried about that, it wasn't the topic she was just thinking about currently. Abigail wanted to put her mother in charge, but she randomly decided she was coming along with them. There wasn't an area of high wind mana like there was stone for John, so her sudden inclusion was strange, but Abigail wasn't able to talk her mother out of it. That being the case, Rachel became next in line to run things. Gabriel decidedly said no, and while Rachel did the same at first, delegating the job to her mom, there was no one else to take up the mantle. Her being the strongest also helped. Braden was too focused on building and Vinny on crafting. Alice, Allison, Mitchell, and Carrie were still down there from helping fight the insects. Sam was uninterested, and so was Ashley, as both were still working through the last of the injured. Her grandmother had long ago checked out from anything involving managing the city. She'd mostly just hung around the cemetery, as depressing as that sounded. Hal could do it, but he was focused on keeping an eye on the surroundings and training up the newest guard company. Chris had finally managed to convince him to take charge officially. There were now 2 orders, as they were calling themselves. Hal's was full of scouts and trackers and wasn't meant to be a direct fighting force, but it still counted. She'd considered Elliot, but she wasn't ready to hand over so much responsibility just yet. Plus, he was still organizing his own order similar to Hal, and he had his hands full with that. Inhale. Exhale. She was getting tense again, thinking about things that weren't necessary. "Are you ready, honey?" John said while sliding atop his horse. "As I'll ever be." It was more like if she didn't leave now, she would rush back to take care of one last thing. Chris. Point of view. The cold continued to be brutal, but I turned my mind to other pursuits rather than lamenting how frigid it was constantly. The novelty of feeling the sensation again had worn off. Quickly. I didn't dread it or hate the feeling as others seemed to, but it was still mighty uncomfortable this far north. I wasn't sure of the exact temperature, but any thermometer would claim it was but ass cold. To distract myself, I focused on one of the 2 tasks I was here for in the first place. I was here to start my mana cultivation, but I was also here for another reason. To purify and strengthen my bloodline as much as possible. So many things had taken my attention that I hadn't done anything with it since gaining it. Both tasks needed insane amounts of pure Arctic or cold mana, which made doing them anywhere except for where I headed nearly impossible. Could have been done. I could have made or constructed something that accumulated enough of the required mana, but it wouldn't have worked out nearly as well. The stuff up here was like straight jet fuel into my veins, and anything I could have come up with wouldn't have come close. A minute or 2 up here would equate to hours, if not days of work down there. Other than making the process much easier, it would also make the final result better for mana cultivation. This was one of the few times when that was even a possibility. Laws didn't have that option. If 2 people gained a law using the same concept, the laws would be the same. If another person used the hardness of ice and cold, causing the increase in density to gain an ice law, they would match my own when I first gained mine. Same with my body of wood. If someone went through the same process, staying conscious the entire time, they would receive the same body as me. Anchors couldn't be quantified in such a way, so it made comparison difficult. This was the first time that there were strict qualities to what I was about to do, and it would dictate how far I would be able to go on this path. A bad first start would make everything all that much harder. Conversely, a good first start would make everything that much easier. I wanted to put my best foot forward, and that meant getting to a place that would make the process that much easier. Which meant I had to keep trudging through the cold and snow. Purifying my bloodline took my mind off the boring task of putting one foot in front of another. I'd been walking or running ahead for so long that the process was mind-numbing and the change was welcome. Like I had seen Rachel doing in Vincent's Forge, I pulled in the Arctic mana around me while letting the less pure mana as a result back out. The process was relatively simple but extremely time-consuming. Rachel working with the mana coming off the spirit fire was nothing compared to the torrent of pure Arctic mana I was using now. She was at a disadvantage there, as there wasn't anywhere close that would help her speed the process up like the rest of us. There was a blip on the map we had that was a bright glowing red, but it was a ways away. Southeast, past where Toronto used to sit. I wouldn't be surprised if she asked to leave to visit just that spot when I returned. The process she was attempting would only go so fast with the resources we had, and a spirit fire could only take her so far. Purifying and strengthening of a bloodline could be done in any order. It didn't matter which you started with first, but I started with purifying. It made more sense to do that first before you strengthened it in my head. You melted out all the impurities in the metal before you began to forge with it. That was just common sense. I wasn't sure if it was just my mental representation of what I was doing, or if reality was how I pictured it, but I imagined my bloodline like a sphere of liquid. I had been able to feel it and call on it ever since I first imbibed it, and it sat in my core dormant ever since besides when I called on it. What I called my core was just how I referred to the place that housed the fundamental pieces of who I was. My anchor was there, my bloodline was there. My laws and something else I still wasn't quite sure what it was. With cores being an actual thing that people will soon have, I should probably start calling it something else. Are they in my soul? We knew that souls were real, but they were impossible to get hard evidence on. It made sense in my head. A soul was where the person's identity was held, so it made sense for the things closely related to who a person was to be stored in their soul. It doesn't matter though. My bloodline was a sphere of a deep purple with hints of blue. The same color of the bloodline essence I had drank so long ago. It had grown slightly since I first gained it, natural use and being in a wintry environment, but only slightly. A beast would naturally refine their bloodline while being in an environment beneficial to them automatically, and humans had the same, if lesser, ability it seemed. Now I was taking a more active role in the process. I imagined it like forcing water through a sieve, controlling the surrounding pure Arctic mana as past I could. I sent it streaming through my body to reach deeper and into where my bloodline was held. Then I forced it through the liquid, drawing it out the other side. It was hard to describe, as my mental projection of how I saw things wasn't exactly what was happening. The process was heavily feeling-based, which made it even harder to put into words. There wasn't much information on the process, as we were told it was instinctual to beasts, which meant there was no need to write the process out. The ones who did write it out were other humans, but we hadn't opted to buy any of those. Information was expensive, and we had to pick and choose where we wanted to know more. Bloodlines, said to be instinctual, weren't high on that list, which meant I had no fucking idea what I was doing. I wasn't even certain I was doing it right, but something was happening. The mana I drew in was more pure than the mana flowing out, which also carried something else with it I couldn't make out. I imagined it was the bad parts one was purifying, but I had no clue what they were. There were also changes in the drop of liquid after the process was over. Some of the dullness was chipped away, and there was a subtle inner glow that was now visible. I took that to mean I was doing something right. An inner glow had to be good, right? The process didn't feel wrong and it wasn't painful, so I continued doing it while I walked. I noticed eventually that as the drop grew brighter, it also decreased in size, which made sense in hindsight. Something inside the drop was being carried out with the less pure mana, which should have made the decrease in volume obvious. The beasts might not have written the process down, but they sure as shit codified it. We didn't even have to buy the information on that, as it was freely given in one of the classes about bloodlines to begin with. The various enlightened bestial races were particular about bloodlines. Their culture put a high value on them, which made the stratified societies they built naturally separate out into various levels or stages based on one's bloodline. Type was the most important. The species it came from dictated nearly everything about a bloodline. The lowliest of prey mice would never hold a candle to even faint dragon blood. Debates were had on which species' bloodline was superior, but each one had different uses, which made it hard to crown the best. Some were better at one thing or another. Other than type, there was tier. There was a distinct tier difference between a true dragon bloodline and a lesser wyvern or drake bloodline. They were all of the same lineage, but there was an obvious difference in power between them. The highest tier a bloodline could reach played a major role in how highly valued its type was. The ceiling of how high it could go determined its value in the eyes of their society. Those two categorized and placed value on the various bloodlines, but they even went a step further than that. The strength and purity of a specific bloodline had its own classifications. So even members of the same species and holders of the same bloodline could compare against one another. Strength was determined by how long they could use it, or the size of the drop in my mental projections case. How I viewed it was probably how most viewed it, as number of drops was how it was measured. I wasn't sure if my singular drop would eventually grow into a second one or when it would be considered that I had 2 drops, but that wasn't a concern of mine. Purity was determined by a percentage and was the only one that was immediately obvious. I likened it to the amount of glow. Most of the reasons bloodlines were classified so thoroughly didn't apply to us. Beasts used it as a show of strength and a way to know their place in society, but mainly used it while determining mates. As I would not be mating with any of them, it was mostly just for clarity's sake. A human could even go without gaining a bloodline and still be powerful, so it wasn't a deciding factor for us. Bloodlines certainly helped, but they weren't the end-all-be-all like they were for the beasts. The last tidbit about bloodlines that we were told was how to evolve them. When a bloodline reached maximum purity and was strengthened as much as possible, an evolution could be triggered that would elevate a bloodline to the next tier, if there was one. WIRM would evolve to Drake, Drake to Wyvern, Wyvern to Lesser Dragon, and Lesser Dragon to True Dragon. In my case, my bloodline's lineage was Frost-touched, Frostborn, Jotun, Lesser Frost Giant, then Frost Giant. There was supposedly something above Frost Giant, but I wasn't sure what. It seemed like it ended naturally at Frost Giant. Starting with a higher-tiered bloodline at Frostborn saved me all the time of purifying and strengthening through the first tier. I wasn't sure how far my current body would take me before I maxed out, but I was eager to find out. Chapter 227, The Other Side of Bloodlines. Viseria Metz. Point of view. Elsewhere, far from Earth and in the far reaches of space, sat a man covered in blood. Black and dripping with corruption was only one way to describe it, as the properties of the blood seemed to shift, never aligning with one thing solidly before deviating to the next. The blood would kill mortals if they even got a whiff of it, yet Viseria sat calmly while covered in the foul liquid. It wasn't his first time. Border details were some of the best places to grow, sometimes one of the only places to grow, but for someone like him who had lived and experienced countless lifetimes, the days of his growth were long over. He still improved. It was hard not to with constant killing and never-ending slaughter, but the days of devouring the essence of other creatures and making it his own were a blip of his past long behind him. Viseria had achieved godhood so long ago that his time as a mortal felt like a brief nap compared to the millennia since. High King Dane's boisterous laughter and shouting insults could be heard for miles around, and it was nearly enough for Viseria to go and say something, but he held back. It was rare for the man to fight himself, and Viseria didn't want to intrude on his time of joy. It was rare to see the stubborn dwarf smile, let alone laugh like he used to. Instead, Viseria watched, observing the rolling darkness, the shifting tides deeper in. He was closer to the blight than he'd been in ages, as the last time he fought was during the time of the 100th integration. Or was it the 110th? He couldn't remember. It had been only a few moons since he started his payment, but he already didn't miss it. It brought back memories he'd rather stay buried. Where he once reveled in battle and the slaughter of his enemies, now it only depressed him instead. Trying hard not to fall into old memories, painful memories, he was assaulted with one he didn't have time to dodge. It accompanied a burst of cold and ice that he'd remember until his dying days. Someone he had been desperately hoping wouldn't come find him was about to arrive, and he could do nothing to stop it. All of the dwarves around quickly vacated his presence, going so far as to put their High King between them and what was coming, as they knew who it was. Viseria had to instantly wonder if this was something she had planned. His border assignment had been close enough to warrant a visit, but not enough that it was compulsory, as her lands bordered Dane's. He'd tried to keep his presence concealed, but he failed. He couldn't remain unnoticed when he was so close to her home. The memories he'd been trying so hard to push away broke through his waning shield of willpower, and they played over in his mind in a split second. Watching her grow up, from the small child to the woman she was today. Her ups and downs as she grasped toward godhood. Her inevitable success when she finally reached it. Her sorrow when he was taken away. The image of his final battle before he fell. His satisfied smile when Viseria finally arrived and he knew he had done it. That had been the reason he stayed away for so long. She was all that his old friend used to be, and it hurt to see her. It drove in the knife that he was gone. So many of them were gone. Viseria had the power and ability to stop her projection. She wasn't even trying to protect it, and it would be as easy as breathing, but he allowed it to continue. This wasn't something he could run from. Not anymore. He owed her that much at least. The swirling burst of cold continued to rotate faster and faster as small snowflakes sprung into being. Space tried to stop them, to clamp down on what was happening, but failed to do so. The growing cold didn't stop there, as it continued to build until halting when it was only slightly larger than an average humanoid. She downsized for me. It was a sign of respect for her to go through the trouble. One Viseria didn't expect her to make after all this time. It wasn't like he cared one way or another, and she knew that, but did it anyway. The custom came about after he had stepped away from Pantheon politics. Memories and experiences continued to play through his mind as the process completed. It was quick, masterfully so, as projections usually took much longer to solidify, and ended with the explosion of the pent-up ball of winter. The snow created shot out in every direction, showering the portion of the sector he was in. It froze anything weak enough not to resist, and he could feel the dwarves on the other side of the sector shiver. Denne had the good sense to not say anything, even though he was close enough to sense what was happening. The stubborn rock was annoying, but he knew when to not butt in. What remained after the buildup of power and the explosion of force was a face he would never forget. White hair as bright as snow on a face just as pale. Piercing blue eyes that drilled into the soul and imparted a chill through only a gaze. Earrings and ornamentations made of ice hung from her ears or pinned up her carefully braided hair, giving off a regal air. Her dress was the same as it always had been. Simple and without flair except for the ice crystals that naturally formed in her presence. She stood staring at him with a scowl. Viseria hadn't expected a warm smile, but a scowl was a bit much. He may not have visited for a long time, but he hadn't done anything worthy of a scowl. "Scotty," he said wistfully, "it's good to see you." Her scowl deepened. Viseria wasn't one that squirmed when in another's presence. He hadn't done so in so long the instinct had died out, but her look of displeasure and continued silence would have caused him to if it hadn't. "I would say the same if I wasn't here for another reason," she said coldly. It hurt to be spoken to in such a way by her, but he didn't show it. She was one of the few that could cause him to feel such a way. "What is it you need, princess?" Viseria slipped before he could correct himself. "Do not call me that," she said forcefully. "I am a princess no longer. You would know if you were at my crowning ceremony. Either of them," she added in a smaller voice, one so different than the forceful one from before. One that hurt infinitely more than being yelled at. A voice of sadness. He said nothing, for there was nothing he could say. He had missed her coronation to become queen because it had been too soon. Her father had just died, and she had been thrust into the position so quickly. He stayed away for much the same reason. Seeing her, who acted so much like he did, he couldn't. It hurt too much. She reminded him too much of the fact his greatest friend was with them no longer. He ended up staying away for so long that by the time she became High Queen, it was easier to remain that way. Easier to push the emotions away than to deal with them. Viseria had always been bad at dealing with them. It was one of his greatest faults. Seeing as he wasn't going to respond, Scotty continued, "I'm not here to reminisce, as you clearly do not wish to. I have but one question, and once I have my answer, I will leave." The words hurt, but he couldn't refute them. "Why did you give out that technique? You promised that you were done trying to find a successor," she asked. Hearing that made him think of the conversation he had not that long ago. It was the reason he was paying his dues out at the border to begin with, and the reason she was here at all. "My stance on that hasn't changed. I am done trying to find a successor," Viseria said. "I haven't given out the technique since last time, and you know how that ended." He had been so close. One step away from completion, but they couldn't take the last step. Like so many others who tried, they couldn't complete it. It was why he was so confident, claiming that the newest attempt would end much the same way. It had happened enough times he'd given up. Scotty looked confused by his response. "You and I are the only two who have it, and I did not give it to the human, and I know it's in his possession. He aims to take the first step as we speak." That didn't surprise him. It had been long enough that the human's preparations should have been made by now. The planet he was on had poles that could sustain the first step. All he had to do was reach close enough to one. You know there is another who can give it out. I swear that I did not, he said. Scotty stiffened at his words, understanding who he was talking about. You know this for a fact? She asked. Why do you think I am here? Viseria waved at the front lines before him. The blight blood that covered him. Scotty understood what he was getting at and nodded, the hint of a smile that he would go so far as to confront it. I see. Then I shall depart, she said, and her projection started to fade, but before it could, he called out. What will you do about it? He asked before she could go. The fading of her projection slowed as her attention turned back to him. Nothing. You and I both know how this will end. Her tone was nearly sad. She had looked for successors just as hard and as long as he had. Both had given up after the repeated failures. The human has your bloodline, he couldn't help but add. Scotty smirked at that. You think I wouldn't know? Your information network is vast, I'll give you that, but when it comes to matters involving my own, even you cannot compare. Viseria highly doubted that but said nothing to refute her. We have watchers that keep up to date on integrations. Any frost giants discovered or humans who take our bloodline are made note of, she said. It's common practice now. Even the Titans do it. The venom with which Titan was said could be understood from the dwarves miles away. Everyone knew of the feud between the two towering races. Does that change how you will handle it? He even has one of Thiassi's hammer fragments. Viseria couldn't help but ask again, adding a bit of information he thought she wouldn't know to prove a point. Knowing of the technique and bloodline were easy. Anyone watching for those specifically would find them without much trouble. The hammer was harder to notice. It was hard enough to get past the screens protecting the new planets, and scanning for the hammer fragment specifically would be a waste of time and effort. Scrying so far and through the protections wasn't cheap after all. Her lack of reaction to his probe proved she had already known about it. Pity. He will be tested like all others have been tested. His circumstances are not unique. Technique or not, hammer or not. If he fails, it will be stripped from him. She answered confidently and with finality. The ability of humans to take on other bloodlines had caused a number of wars when it was first found out. The dragons, specifically, took umbrage to the fact weaklings could take after them. Dragons would look down on their own children in contempt if they displayed such traits, let alone someone not of their race. The race wars that sparked from the dispute were one of the few times in Viseria's long memory that the kingdoms of man truly banded together. For a race so divided, they unified for only a scant few reasons, and that was one of them. They refused any outside influence that would dictate how they could use their own racial trait. No other race had stipulations on how their racial advantages could be used, and they fought for years demanding the same. The fact they won was surprising to all. Not every race went to war over it, as some didn't care, but enough did that most believed the humans didn't stand a chance, especially with the dragons standing against them. It was one of the first times the tenacity of man was put on display. The agreement and compromise they came to afterward had been in place ever since. Enforced by both sides to this day, millennia later. The race the bloodline was from could test if the human could keep it. If they passed, the challenge was dropped. If they failed, the bloodline was stripped. I doubt he will fail, Viseria commented. He'd seen enough of the tutorial to know that much. He upholds your principles well, even embodying some better than some giants I know. I know, but he will be tested all the same, Scotty said. With the conversation coming to a natural end, Viseria only had one more thing to say. It was more of intuition how he knew, but he mentioned it to her all the same. Do not bless him, he said sternly. She looked confused, but he went on. He will not take kindly to it, and I suspect he will refuse any blessing offered to him. Even from me? Scotty smirked with a hint of smugness. She hadn't blessed anyone in ages, and he doubted she would start now anyway. He shot her down hard. Even from you. The blessing of the High Queen of Frost Giants was a boon no one would refuse lightly, but for some reason Viseria could see the human refusing on principle. Not after what Callum did. Scotty's projection faded slightly, and her attention turned away before coming back to him. I must go. She hesitated. It was nice seeing you again. Her image faded completely and Viseria was left alone again. His heart was in pain. Emer, how much she's grown. Chapter 228 Mammoths. Chris. Point of view. Well, I'll be damned. Light filtered through the area below where I stood nearly horizontally from how the sun was positioned, and the shadows that it made were long and distorted. Even with the waning light, I could clearly see the beasts milling about down below. The frozen wasteland I was marching through had its ups and downs. Not every iceberg froze perfectly level with the one next to it, causing cliffs and ravines to form even though it was all one big sheet of ice. Below marched a line of elephant-sized creatures with enough fur to stuff over a dozen beds to the brim. Tusks extended well past their bodies and a hefty bulk that caused the frozen ice to rumble as they walked. Woolly mammoth. Level 108. Identify, finally putting in work as the beasts didn't have any way to block it. It had been a long time since I used the skill on a human, as most picked up a way to block it by now. I went by feel most of the time anyway, and these things felt like a threat. Even individually, I wasn't confident in beating one in a fight. It was odd to feel myself so small, as it was usually the opposite sensation I was feeling. The line of them pounded south as I stood and watched from above. They had noticed me, and I saw at least a few look up or indicate a trunk my way, but they continued on their way unperturbed. They didn't even feel the slightest threat at my presence. It was humbling. It also made me realize how big-headed I'd gotten. A part of me wanted to take one on just to see if I could win, but that died as I saw something else. Woolly mammoth matriarch. Level 132. That was a death wish. Fighting that would more than likely end with me trampled into the ground. In the past, I hadn't run from many fights, but this was one I wouldn't win. It was a surprise to see creatures so strong. We knew that beasts grew faster than humans, and we saw how fast they continued to grow as the ambient mana went up, but this was something else. The beasts around Frostheim had already increased by a dozen levels on average, but that was still only high E rank, not D rank. The only way for new people to find things to kill was in the first few levels of the dungeon, or if they stumbled upon an adolescent or juvenile in the wild. Everything that made it to adulthood had grown past what F ranks would be able to kill, and we were in a higher-than-average mana density zone. Another reason they felt strong was because the matriarch exuded power as she walked. The hint of bloodline leaking out scared off any would-be predators as wolves, bears, and cats went running as they stomped by. At first, I was curious why they were going south of all directions, but my mind started working before long. It had been weeks of the mind-numbing dull task of filtering mana through my bloodline, and I hadn't had to think about anything in a while. My first thought was that moving away from the high mana area, especially the Arctic mana the creatures here loved, was against their growth, but it wasn't long before I figured out why. They were following the food. One would think stepping onto the ice shelf would completely kill all the available food that could grow, but that would be incorrect. As fantastical as the thought of plants growing in the Arctic was, it didn't stop there. There was plant growth on the sheet of ice itself, let alone where there was still tundra they could extend their roots in. The frequency of the plant life I came across dramatically declined after stepping off solid ground, but there were still clusters of bushes every once in a while. Not nearly enough to sustain a herd of mammoths, though, which was probably why they were migrating south. The weather would only get worse, and they were riding the edge of it as they traveled, threading the line between food availability and mana density. Seeing the behemoths was cool, and I was intrigued with how they reached D rank so quickly, but I couldn't afford to follow them. I already wasted time watching them for as long as I did. I couldn't afford to be careless like I had so far. There was only a limited amount of time I could travel every day, and I was wasting it watching from high up. My beloved resistance, my affinity that I adored, was failing me. That sounded worse than it was, but in reality, I was in an area that went past what I could handle. Even Vincent could be burned by fire, and I was experiencing the same now. The fact that the North Pole was still so far away made me hopeful for the future. If I was being stopped here, barely a few miles into the Arctic Circle, what kind of place was the North Pole? What kind of mana did it have? What kind of beasts claimed it as their territory? But most importantly, how strong were they? I falsely thought that dungeons would hold the only challenge I could sharpen myself with, and that had been flat wrong. I just didn't explore enough to find that challenge in the world at large. Even though I was being hindered by the weather and I was becoming dangerously close to freezing to death, I still pushed on. Limiting my travel to the day helped, but that slowed things down too much. There were only a few moments of sunlight this far up, and they were dwindling fast. Darkness reigned for the vast majority of the day, and the cold plummeted as the sun stayed away. Soon it would be only darkness until the winter broke. In addition to getting as much ground under me during the heat of the day, Jotun's resistance propped me up enough to not immediately freeze. I had to take frequent breaks and stop completely when my mana ran dry, but it allowed me to travel without relying on the scant moments of sunlight. It quickly became a mad dash through the day to get the most out of the light, then a mad dash as the sun went down until my mana ran dry, and then I would dig out a shelter to get out of the elements. Digging into the ice under me was easy enough with my abilities, and the mini igloos I built weren't that hard to make. The miniature caves created a line leading north as I had to stop and make new ones every night. Soon, when the light finally disappeared and I couldn't venture out even with Jotun's resistance, I would be at my end. I would do it there and could only hope it was enough. A positive to all the downtime I had while sitting in my carved-out shelter was the time I spent refining my bloodline. It was going remarkably quickly with all the pure mana I had access to, much faster than how Rachel described it. I knew density and purity of the surrounding mana played a role in how fast the process was, but this was like night and day. If someone ever found an area made for them, it would take ripping it out of their death grip to take it away. At least that was how I would feel. I still wasn't sure if I had 2 drops yet, or what percentage I was at in terms of purity, but I continued on anyway. It reminded me of smithing in that respect. The repetitive motions and cyclic actions. Purifying, driving the size down until I couldn't go any further. Strengthening back up to the size it was, and repeat. My first round of purifying revealed that there was only so small I could go. If that was classified as 1 drop or some fraction of a drop was unclear, but once I reached a minimum, purifying wouldn't do anything anymore. Maybe if I go too low the bloodline won't work? Like there is a bare minimum bloodline essence in order for it to function. I wasn't sure and didn't much care about figuring out why. I could leave that to others and focus on other pursuits. There were only a few more minutes of daylight, so after I was done marveling at the extinct creatures that walked the earth again, I took off in a sprint. Another skill I had to pick up quickly was scanning for threats. It was how I noticed the mammoths in the first place. I had run headfirst into a fight more than once, which only took away from the time I could have been traveling. It also drained my mana to fight, forcing me to stop and refill it. It took some trial and error, but I managed to figure out a way to avoid that. It still didn't work on anything trying to be stealthy, and I'd gotten a claw to the back or face a few times to drive that point in, but it worked on anything not trying to hide. Lynx and snow leopards were nasty little things full of rage and anger. Some could say they were devil spawn, but I'd fought demons less ferocious than the angry cats. My method was simple. The way I felt if something was strong was through my aura. Gabriel called it a primitive and rudimentary aura scan, but it was the best I could do. Using that as a guide, I extended it out ahead of me and felt for anything that could pose a challenge. At first, I scanned for anything I could feel, but that had me avoiding rodents in the snow or critters that would run rather than fight. Avoiding them was a waste of time, as they wouldn't have tried to fight me anyway. With nothing better to do, and my mind free to the task, I iterated and tweaked what I was scanning for until I found something that worked. My sprint in the light didn't last long and night descended rapidly, casting everything into shadow and driving the temperature even colder. Most creatures found places to stay out of the wind and cold, which made the trip easier. Jotun's resistance flooded my body with mana, staving away the cold, and I picked up my speed. Nighttime let me be a little more careless compared to the day. My mana dwindled quickly trying to fuel the legendary skill, and less than an hour later I was digging out another cave. I sat and focused on pulling more mana in and shoving it through my bloodline for a few hours until I was capped again and the process started over. Nearly an hour later I was carving out another igloo miles from the last one. I had tried to oscillate using the skill before. Flare it for a reprieve, then turn it off for a while and turn it on again when I got so cold I couldn't go further. While that allowed me to stretch my mana further, it stopped being effective after a few tries. The skill didn't heat me up. All it did was allow me to resist being slowed and the pain while it was active. So when the skill turned off, the feelings came rushing back and I nearly froze stiff the one time I tried it. The igloos allowed me to get out of the wind for one, which was priority numero uno. And it let me trap what little body heat I produced, warming me up. I was positive I didn't run at my previous 98.6 degrees, but it was still way above the ambient temperature, making the small dwelling much warmer than outside. Occasionally, I would reread the technique I was about to preform, to make absolutely sure I memorized it, but otherwise, traveling and refining were the only things I did. The process of igniting my mana heart was thoroughly burned into my brain by now. Chapter 229 Ignition. Igniting a mana heart is a process that demands extreme precision and effort of will. It is not for the faint of heart and can even be deadly in some instances. I write this not to dissuade you from doing it, but to inform you of the possible outcomes. To achieve even a partial ignition is to be celebrated. Most would be glad to make it to that point. A partial ignition is far from the best outcome but is still leagues ahead of the worst that can occur. Similar to how there are grades for forging a mana core, there are grades for how well the ignition process goes. Scholars, if nothing else, like grading things. The lowest grade possible is partial ignition. Any lower and the process fails, causing extreme damage to the heart and mana channels, sometimes resulting in death. Bad ignitions can even cripple the user, making them unable even to try again. A flickering ignition is a step above partial but still far from the best. While partial ignition has the capability of 10 to 50% of perfect ignition, flickering has 50 to 75%. Sputtering ignition is 75 to 90% effective. Full ignition is 90 to 99% effective. Perfect ignition uses all of the available mana and turns the mana pool entirely into a mana heart, leaving no waste behind, and using all there is to fuel the heart that is formed. Why the grades are divided how they are is simple. The ignition process is one of transformation first and foremost. It turns the previous mana pool that everything has into a roaring mana heart comparable to mana cores. If the entire mana pool isn't transformed, the mana heart only runs on a portion of what it should, causing the effectiveness to decrease. Excerpt from Introduction to Mana Cultivation Techniques by Master Arcanist Woodridge of the Baraxi Mage Tower. Chris. Point of view. I slumped into the soft snow as exhaustion overcame me and blood dyed the white snow red. Both mine and my foes. The last trickle of what had once been a full mana pool was cascading through me, staving off hypothermia. Jotun's resistance was an amazing skill, one of the only reasons I was still alive, but it was a mana hog. If I'd had to use Blizzard and Permafrost on top of constantly running the skill at full power, I would run out in minutes. As it was, the area literally couldn't be enhanced any further with my two beloved skills, leaving most of my mana available for other things. Namely, Jotun's resistance. The practice I had gotten with the skill over the month of using it helped alleviate the cost as my mastery grew, but the increased efficiency gain was a drop in the bucket compared to the raging ocean of mana the skill sucked up. Frost armor lay in pieces with most scat about the scene of the fight. Only a select few of the armor segments were still attached to my body. Even my law and spirit weren't enough to keep it from being torn asunder. My hammer was buried spike first into the head of the body that lay beside me. It was a tough fight, one of the most difficult I'd been in since ever. Even the fight against the wave of vine bears didn't compare. I didn't count the demons because I didn't end up fighting them. The explosion did most of the work. The best part, and one I knew would make Austin giggle like a schoolgirl, was that my foe wasn't anything scary or ferocious. It wasn't the pack of direwolves I'd run into, nor was it the various feline predators that sleuthed through the snow and liked to jump at my back. It was a moose. A very big moose, taller than what my house used to be, but a moose nonetheless. And it had nearly killed me. Fighting the battle with reservations hadn't helped, but the fact I nearly died anyway was worrying. I was so worried about ending up on bedrest again, causing me to miss my chance to ignite my mana heart, forcing me to wait yet another year that I hadn't fought the same. My style of fighting was smothered in the art of going blow for blow, that trying to shy away from being hit nearly ended the fight then and there because of mistakes that I made. I knew I was coming to the end of the line, but being stopped by a moose hurt my pride. To cheer me up, I took the antlers from the towering beast. Matching the moose in size, they were spayed out, spanning over 10 feet wide and nearly half that in depth. They would be a nightmare when trying to mount and find a spot for them, but I wanted them. They were the perfect trophy to bring back. They required a sled to haul and would slow me down tremendously, but it wasn't like I was traveling much further. Plus, the sled allowed me to take a few more choice pieces that could be used in crafting. After a rest, some light butchering, and constructing a sled out of ice, I took off at the best speed I could. It was only a few steps past where I ran into the moose that I stopped dead. There was a change in the air, one I'd felt before. The common prey animals were silent, most likely missing completely. No birds called overhead, and I couldn't spot anything loping about in the snow. That wasn't all that uncommon, but what accompanied all of that was a stifling oppression. One that marked the few times I had truly been frightened. My body instinctively shivered at the memory, and I couldn't stop the goosebumps that started spreading, and not from the cold. I wouldn't forget that day anytime soon. At the time, I had been running from a pack of wolves when all of a sudden they stopped chasing me. They acted like there was an invisible line they wouldn't cross even though I'd stopped running and stood only a few feet from them. Much like the line I'd just stepped over. Confused me at first, but then I heard it. The bear must have noticed my intrusion into its territory and belted out a roar that rattled my bones. The wolves whimpered and stopped dead while I froze completely, doing my best to remain still and hopefully unseen. As I felt the oppressive aura near, both the wolves and I turned tail and ran for our lives. That was an experience I wasn't fond of repeating. I hadn't even laid eyes on it, yet just the power-infused roar was enough for me to know without a shadow of a doubt. The thing would kill me. It wouldn't even be a fight either. It would maul me with ease and then eat me for breakfast. Before the same thing could happen again, I slowly backed away from the bear's territory and made to create some distance so I didn't accidentally cross over it again. I'm at my end. The thought frustrated me, but I knew there was nothing I could do about it. It wasn't only the fierce fight with the moose that forced my decision to stop pushing north. Hypothermia was becoming a major concern, and I was running into more things that could kill me, like the bear. If I kept pushing, I'd be forced into a fight I couldn't win. While the mammoths were the first, they weren't the only thing that threatened me up here, and I had to run from a mounting list of creatures. Herds of woolly rhinos paraded around with dominance. A dominance I would be splattered against if I stood against it. Both the wolves and felines had grown past what I could handle. Last but certainly not least were the bears. Any altercation with one of those would be my end. Knowing that, realizing that, and internalizing that fact was tough. I wasn't used to this. Not being at the top was a tough pill to swallow, and it was rough on its way down. With defeat and a slight bit of envy toward the aura of something so much stronger than myself, I ended my travels north. Now all I had to do was find an open area to settle down. Turning around hurt, but it made finding an area to set up in easier. I'd seen a few places during my short sprints that could work, and it wasn't that hard to backtrack until I found one. Using the hidey holes I had already carved out made things all that much easier, and it wasn't long until I found one. To prepare, the first thing I did was mark out a large circle around the area I had claimed. Igniting my mana heart would both take time and leave me vulnerable. To defend against that, I formed thick walls of ice mimicking a stout fortress around where I would sit. The ice formed easily, taking to what I envisioned with glee, and there was abundant material to work with. The dome I ended up forming stood multiple feet thick, and I doubted anything would be able to get through quickly. A full charge of one of the woolly rhinoceroses I'd come across would shatter it with ease, but they didn't attack unless provoked. I was also far away from any of the herds that roamed. When I picked where I was going to do it, that had been a major concern. I couldn't have things stumble upon me mid-process. In addition to the thick dome of ice, I carved runes along the inner and outer surfaces. They weren't my runes or ones I'd designed in any way, but they worked perfectly for what I had in mind. They were originally from when I built the wind chamber. It was the store-bought formation barrier that separated one area from another, but cut apart and repurposed. My increased familiarity was enough to pick out the section of the formation I needed, but it was still a rough copy-paste situation. I didn't care for the defensive barrier it formed and discarded that portion, only keeping the part that delineated one area from another. I didn't have the materials to power a defensive barrier, and those were less than stealthy. I tested the hack job I did to the formation, and it worked for what I needed it to do. It separated what was inside the dome from what was outside the dome. Second, I carved a generic mana-gathering formation running along the flattened ground and inner surface. The first formation on the exterior was to keep everything contained. The second was to draw in as much mana as possible. The gathering formation without the containment would just cause the gathered mana to leak out again. The formation would increase the concentration of mana around it, but it wouldn't be able to stop the gathered mana from leaving. Both combined and working together created an artificial mana chamber that ratcheted up the density of mana in a given area. Similar to forming a mana core, igniting a mana heart took asinine amounts of mana and was why I was up here in the first place. The surrounding Arctic mana was already thicker and more pure than anything I had ever felt, but this took that even further. There was no reason not to when I had the ability to create it. The dome took a few days to get right and iron out all the kinks, but as soon as the runes were carved and powered, the area began to drown in Arctic mana. If any beast sensed it, they would come running from miles away. Another reason for the containment formation. Now that the formations were powered, I was technically on a time crunch. I'd snag some mana crystals and pack them along for just this reason, but they would run out eventually and the formations would run out of power. I'd planned for 3 months, which was overkill, and what I was attempting should only take a week or two, especially with where I was, but it didn't hurt to be prepared. As time went by and the formations worked together, the mana became so concentrated it began to fog. It caused a frost to form in the air naturally because the area was so dense in the stuff. During this time, I continued to work on my bloodline and prepared myself for what was to come. When the density peaked, and the gathering formation pulled in as much as it could, it was time to get to work. I was going for broke, and I sent off a silent prayer I wouldn't die. Chapter 230 Past Experiences. Chris. Point of view. I'd read Abigail's precious books enough to know the difference between one grade to the next was more than the percentages signified. A perfect ignition was so much more than a few percentage points than a full ignition. A mana heart was more than only a mana pool. It linked the physical aspects of my body to my magical aspects, a melding of both flesh and blood along with arcane. The percentages only referred to one side, while there were benefits for both that the grades didn't explicitly come out and mention, leaving percentages the main way to break them apart. Mana cores weren't like that. They were rather simple in their execution. Their grade was solely based on how well the core was forged. That was only a start of the two techniques' differences. If body refining could be considered the pure physical side of the body path, mana cores could be considered the pure magical side. Forging a core would forever keep the two separate. Igniting a mana heart would start the process of linking the two. One book even stated that mana cultivation and body refining didn't used to be separate. That once, long ago, they were one and the same. It was why they were both considered part of the body now, even though for most, they were entirely separate. If capacity, concentration, and regeneration were the absolute goal, mana cores were hands down the best. They were those three ideals taken to the extreme at the expense of everything else and failed to offer any other benefits. Cores did those three things the best, but only those three things. Mana hearts, while also increasing capacity, concentration, and regeneration, did more than just that. Where they fell behind in that area compared to cores, they provided other benefits that made it more than a worthy trade-off. It was the path a warrior usually took, while cores were the path of the mage. Mana hearts got their name from what the process entailed. To form one, or ignite one as the process described, the mana pool was both moved and transformed. It took the mana pool from just above the sternum and placed it inside the heart, which was the reason why the worst-case scenario was death. A failed ignition could rupture the heart. Doing so also removed the need for separate mana channels, as moving mana throughout the body was done naturally through blood flow. After forming a mana heart, the second step was to merge the leftover mana channels into the circulatory system, strengthening them and making the entire system more robust. Not doing so would cause undue stress on arteries and veins that they weren't designed to handle. Linking the physical with the magical would empower both to a certain degree depending on which foot led. If the body was significantly physically stronger, the arcane side would gain more of a benefit. The reverse would happen if the opposite was true. Seeing how my body refining was a step ahead of my mana cultivation, and my strength, fortitude, and endurance towered over my wisdom and intelligence, the outcome was obvious. The scales being so lopsided as they were was common in warriors, and why this path of mana cultivation was dubbed so, but it didn't mean that all of the benefits were magical. The link also worked in reverse to a lesser degree. Where hearts lost out to cores in one regard, they made up for it here. Having mana, along with blood, coursing through the body empowered what was already there. Not only did the blood carry oxygen to muscles, it also carried an alternative fuel source in mana, boosting the flesh past what it could once handle. While it made the body stronger, there were trade-offs other than being less effective than cores. The lack of dedicated mana channels made advanced spells harder to form and activate, but I had none of those. The only people I knew with advanced spells were Rachel and Gabriel. I hadn't even known what they were at first, and it wasn't until Gabriel described them to me that I realized I didn't have any. He said it had something to do with the spell matrix, but without an example it was hard to understand. If I did get any in the future, I wasn't that worried about it. Harder did not mean impossible. Overall, the trade-off was worth it. Mana hearts made the body stronger and all around more enduring, which was exactly the kind of thing I needed, while also raising my magical abilities. It made spells harder, but I wasn't going to be doing those anyway. It only took a brief thought to dismiss forming a core when the choice was originally proposed. Not least of which because my technique didn't allow for that. The stars of Primordial Frost didn't even have forging a core as an option. Not that I wanted to anyway. Calm down, Christopher. I was getting ahead of myself again. Waiting for the mana to peak allowed time for my mind to stray, and it was starting to spiral. I didn't need to rethink my decision to form a heart over a core. The choice was obvious, and I didn't need to rehash it. The gathering formation reached its cap of pulling in more mana, and the density inside my dome peaked. It's time. I was unsure exactly what day it was, as they blended together with so little sunlight to go off of, but it was the day I would ignite my heart. Darkness was all that my eyes could see, and other than the well of mana to my senses, there was nothing else I focused on. Taking a few deep breaths to center myself, I began. Time had already lost meaning when the sun stopped coming up and darkness reigned endlessly, but even if I wanted to keep track of it now, I would be unable to. My undivided attention was focused on the process, as I wouldn't allow any slip-ups. My full pool of mana was drawn out as I sent it looping through my flesh. I had plenty of practice feeling it with Jotun's resistance, that doing it manually only took a few attempts. It was hard to expend and control my entire mana pool, but I eventually got the hang of it. While I drew it out, I sent what regenerated into my heart. The process hurt, both my mind controlling so much mana at once, and my heart as the Arctic mana freeze burned the beating organ. But I pushed through. My modified heart reduced the pain, but it was still there. The first step was to move my mana pool, and that required time and dedication. Changing the point where the mana I generated originated from, however small, was painstakingly hard. It kept wanting to snap back to where it used to be, and it took my entire control to keep that from happening. It was not without failure. The small specks of mana took a firm hand to keep in place and did everything in their power to snap back to where they used to be. Like grains of sand slipping from my hand, the mana squeezed past my mental grasp, dragging all I worked for down with them. All progress I had made in moving my mana pool over was lost, and the pain started anew as I started over after the failure. If I didn't have experience holding so much mana together while engraving, it would have been that much harder. Repeated failure would make it take longer and a lot more painful, but what was a little pain? I wanted this to be flawless. A day passed, or maybe it was two. I wasn't sure and didn't care. My heart burned from the freezing cold, and tears welled up and froze around my eyes. The small trickle of regeneration took hours to fill up in its new place inside my heart, and even though it was the only mana I had to control, it still slipped and raged to go back. Every failure extended the suffering. It was like trying to hold a tiny magnet away from its opposite, and with every passing second, another set needed to be kept separate. Even worse, it gelled like liquid, sneaking past the firm hold I tried to have. Soon, but not soon enough, my mana's need to go back diminished ever so slightly. My heart and body grew, not accustomed, but tolerant to what I was trying to accomplish, and the changes began to settle. It didn't make it any less difficult, though. Just because the force was lessened didn't mean it went away. All I had to do was hold everything in place. Hold. Any speck of mana that tried to escape was ruthlessly grasped and sent back to where it was supposed to be. My mind was on fire from the exercise, and that said nothing of the continuous pain it caused. It reminded me of being torn apart in the wind chamber for days on end. The pain made time seem fleeting and my brain delirious. The process became incrementally easier as things settled into place, but after clamping down on it for so long it ended up being harder. My mind was worn out. My body was worn out. And this was only the first step. It would only end when the ignition was over. Eventually, after an unknowable amount of time, everything stopped. My mana stopped attempting to leave my heart, and all of it settled into its new home. The pain remained, as Arctic mana was still saturating the organ, but my mind could rest. Not completely. If I lost complete control, things would snap back, but the effort to keep things how they were was minuscule compared to what it used to be. The only thing that could force the change to be permanent was to finish the process. I kept a vigilant watch over everything while allowing my brain to rest as best I could. Sleeping would let me recover completely, but that would also make everything fall apart. The next step was make or break time, and I wanted to be at my best. As ready as I could be, I began again. Ignition required a critical mass to occur. The mana held inside the organ had to go far above and beyond what my pool normally held to kickstart the process. Once critical mass was reached, the ignition process was mostly natural. Stuffing so much mana over my normal capacity into a space that couldn't accommodate it was not. Pain seared my chest as mana escaped the space I was stuffing it into. It shot out as the pressure built, sending waves of pain behind in the trail of what escaped. I needed to reach a point that was triple my normal capacity. Only then could I begin the process the technique described, which felt impossible. The booklet described the more mana at the point of ignition, the better odds of achieving perfection. The steps detailed didn't even allow for anything less, as it would fail. It was full or perfect ignition or bust. There wasn't even an option for anything less. If I'd known how hard the technique would be, I would have chosen something else. That's a lie, and you know it. I wouldn't have. Still, not even having the option to choose an easier technique annoyed me, not that I would have. That's what I get for letting the guide decide on which technique was best. The formations pumped a continuous stream of mana inside the dome and made it that much easier to stuff more inside me. The mana I used and stuffed down was endlessly replaced with new mana to work with. Without them, it would fall on me to gather the surrounding mana instead of the formation. If I were like Rachel, with the manipulation skills to drag in mana from leagues around, the formations would be pointless, but I couldn't do what she could. It also made it so I had one less thing to worry about. All I had to do was reach beyond my body and yank the readily available mana into me. Stuff it down. And keep it there. Mana that escaped left a line of frost that burned through my body, but I couldn't falter due to pain. It had been a long time since I faltered because of pain. My mind replayed every time that fate tried to get me to falter, and I stood tall in defiance. I weathered their challenge, and I was the one to remain standing. It was my anchor. It was who I was. I was someone who had stood at the forefront of an avalanche of beasts that would try to get past, and I denied them. It was me that stood strong, and this was just another trial. One that I would dominate. Pain was forgotten, and I channeled everything I had into stuffing the mana down. Compressing what was already there to give room for more. Just how my law was first formed. I needed ice that was denser, stronger, and the same applied now. It felt like everything I had was coming together to help me now. How I first gained my law, my anchor, my experiences. all played in my head, leaving behind the lessons I learned and the skills I gained. Colder, denser, stout and enduring. Unconsciously, my spirit rose to the challenge and its energy cascaded throughout my body, my heart included. What felt like would be the maximum my heart could go moved even further. My spirit extending what it could take that much further. The bar moved, and I continued sucking in mana. It was the process of making my hammer in reverse. Instead of having everything I had drained, I filled everything I could in. Yet another experience to draw on. I burned my bloodline next. The newly strengthened and purified energy provided a rush of vitality through my heart and pushed things further. With the bar raised again, I kept going. The total mana pushed well past double my capacity. Blew beyond triple, even quadruple. When I could go no further, 5 times as much mana as I usually held was stuffed inside my heart, roaring to get out or be let go. The only thing keeping it from igniting was my willpower keeping it so. The mana was mine and it would not ignite until I told it to. With my body filled to bursting, and my heart metaphorically tearing at the seams, I willed it to ignite. Without my will keeping it from doing so, and long ago reaching critical mass, the Arctic mana exploded out, furiously raging through my body. It raced down my arteries and veins, bursting out my capillaries and into flesh. Every blood vessel, no matter how big or small, was scoured by the gushing mana. This was what would determine how well I did. The mana that stayed behind and began the process scoured its new container of my heart and began converting my mana pool into something more. Without the need to guide the raging mana any longer, I began inscribing my heart in frozen runes as my technique described. I didn't know what they did nor what they meant. They weren't even in the runic language I knew, but I'd drawn them so many times I could do it even with my mind feeling like mush. Inscribing them felt like I was taking a hot knife straight to my insides, but I pushed through the pain like I had countless times before.